A 96-year-old woman gave a house to a homeless veteran and his dog, but God had bigger plans. They said some gifts arrive wrapped in light rather than ribbon, carried not by hands, but by moments that feel guided, as if the world pauses long enough for a quiet blessing to find its way through. And on certain winter mornings, when the cold settles gently instead of harshly, a person might sense that something unseen has stepped a little closer. The day began like that, soft, breath-like, the kind of stillness that makes a listener out of anyone who hasn't yet given up on hope. The wind drifted low across the hills, brushing along frozen fences and abandoned mailboxes, stirring only enough to hint at stories older than the town itself. Frost clung to the windows of passing trucks like thin silver lace, and the pale sun rose slow over the horizon, moving with the unhurried confidence of something that had all the time in the world. Far down the quiet road, a worn pickup rolled forward, its engine humming a tired note that suggested it had seen better years but wasn't ready to quit. Behind the fogged windshield sat a man who carried the same stubborn endurance. Caleb Rowan held the wheel loosely, shoulders slightly hunched inside a faded winter jacket, his breath faintly visible in the cold air. There was a gentleness to the way he sat, the kind born not from comfort, but from a life that had taught him how to move softly, even when the world had not moved softly with him. His face, pale from long nights in the cold, carried no anger, only a quiet persistence, as if each mile he traveled was one more small promise kept to himself. Beside him rested Ranger, a 6-year-old German shepherd whose coat of sable and cream caught the thin morning light through the glass. Ranger lay curled yet alert, ears tilting slightly at every shift in the wind. The dog did not whine, did not pace. He simply listened, the way creatures do when instinct becomes their compass. To any passerby, they would look like two travelers without a destination, two silhouettes moving through a world that had forgotten their names. But there was a steadiness to them, a closeness built from weathered nights and unspoken loyalty. The truck drifted along a narrow stretch where the trees grew taller and the snow deepened, muffling the world into a soft, cinematic hush. Pine branches sagged gently beneath their white burden, releasing occasional flakes that floated down like thoughts too quiet to speak aloud. The air smelled of cold earth and distant wood smoke, carrying with it the faint echo of something watchful, as though the land itself was aware of their passing. Caleb guided the truck slower, not out of caution, but because the world around him felt like a place meant to be entered respectfully. Ranger lifted his head then, nose tapping the air once, twice. His body stiffened, not with fear, but focus. A single breath later, he gave one soft, deliberate bark. Not loud, not urgent. Simply a note placed gently into the silence, like a fingertip pressed to a page before turning it. Caleb glanced toward him. Ranger rarely spoke without reason. The dog's gaze fixed ahead, toward a bend in the road where morning light pooled strangely against the snow, brighter than it should have been, as if reflecting off something unseen. Caleb slowed further. The world felt paused, listening. Ranger's ears twitched again, a subtle tremor traveling down his spine. There was no wind at that moment, no movement among the trees, only that quiet brightness waiting at the curve. It was nothing a man could explain, just a feeling, a suggestion, a door about to open. And before the moment could settle into certainty, we return now to the man at the wheel, the one the world had almost overlooked. The strange brightness at the bend lingered like a held breath as Caleb guided the pickup forward, the tires whispering over the thin layer of frost. Ranger remained upright now, steady and intent, his gaze locked ahead with the kind of focus that only came when something in the world shifted just slightly out of place. As they rounded the curve, the lights softened into something ordinary again, the kind of morning glow that brushed gently across old porches and sagging fences. Yet the air carried a quiet expectancy, as if whatever had stirred a moment before had only stepped aside, waiting. On the right stood a narrow gravel driveway leading to a small weathered house. Its white paint had faded into a soft gray, and the porch leaned just enough to suggest it had survived many winters without asking for much. At the edge of the drive, a thin figure stood near a crooked mailbox, her gloved hands trying to lift a metal hinge that no longer wished to cooperate. Her back was slightly curved under the weight of her 96 years, but there was a clarity in the set of her shoulders that spoke of someone who had made peace with the slow march of time. Ranger let out a single soft woof, the sound low and respectful, as if he recognized something familiar in her presence. Caleb slowed the truck, a subtle concern stirring inside him. He pulled over, stepping out into the cold air that wrapped around him like a thin veil. Snow crunched under his boots, and his breath rose in a small cloud as he approached the woman. She looked up, her eyes a pale blue softened by age, yet bright enough to see farther than most people his age ever could. For a moment, neither spoke. The wind quieted, almost obliging them with a pocket of stillness. She offered a small smile. "This stubborn thing never did want to behave in the winter," she said, her voice thin but steady. Caleb returned the smile with a nod and reached for the hinge. The metal was icy beneath his fingers, and the wood beneath was brittle, but a gentle adjustment was all it needed. The mailbox settled back into place with a soft click, the sound unexpectedly satisfying in the morning quiet. "There," he said softly. "Just needed a little patience." The woman studied him with a gaze deeper than the moment required, as if she were measuring something not visible in the cold light. Ranger approached her side, tail low, ears relaxed, offering a polite presence. She reached out and brushed her gloved fingers lightly over his head. "Well now," she murmured, "you are a fine guardian." Caleb noticed then the way the house behind her seemed to lean toward them slightly, its windows catching the faintest shimmer of morning light. It felt as if the place itself were watching, waiting for something to unfold. The old woman straightened with care. "Would you both care for some tea? It is too cold to be wandering without warming up a little." Caleb hesitated out of instinct rather than reluctance, but Ranger stepped forward first, pausing at the bottom of her porch steps with a gentle confidence. As if he knew this was where they were meant to be. The woman's smile widened, as though the dog had confirmed a quiet thought of hers. "My name is Evelyn Whitford," she said. "This old house gets lonely. It would be nice to have company." Caleb felt a soft tug inside, the kind of pull that did not come from need, but from recognition. He followed her toward the porch. That was when Ranger stopped. His ears pricked sharply, and his head tilted toward the far corner of the house. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor passed through his stance, not fear, but awareness. He released a breathy sound, not quite a bark, not quite a whine, a tone that seemed to reach into the quiet morning and point toward something unseen. Evelyn paused, her eyes following Ranger's gaze. The wind did not move. The trees did not sway, yet something in that stillness felt gently disturbed, like the surface of a pond touched by a single falling leaf. "Come along," she said softly, though a hint of knowing warmed her voice. "There will be time to see what he is sensing." And so the morning opened its door a little wider as we return now to the man stepping onto the porch of a house he had never expected to approach. The porch creaked gently beneath Caleb's boots as he stepped inside the narrow house, the air carrying the warm scent of peppermint tea and old cedar. Ranger lingered near the threshold for a moment, his gaze sweeping the room with the quiet focus of a guardian reading a landscape. Evelyn moved slowly but with practiced familiarity, lighting a small lamp on a wooden table. The glow spread softly, revealing framed photographs lining the walls like quiet witnesses to years long past. Caleb removed his gloves, rubbing his hands together for warmth. The house felt surprisingly alive, as if it exhaled around him, a hush settling across the room in a way that made the outside cold feel further than it truly was. Evelyn poured tea into 2 chipped porcelain cups, their patterns faded but lovingly preserved. "Sit, dear," she said, her voice carrying the gentleness of someone who had spent a lifetime learning how to offer comfort without demanding anything in return. He hesitated only a second before lowering himself into a sturdy wooden chair. Ranger approached his side, but the dog's attention kept drifting toward a closed door at the end of the hallway. His ears lifted, then lowered, a subtle rhythm that suggested he was tracking something Caleb could not hear. The old woman followed Ranger's line of sight with a small, knowing tilt of her head. "That room belonged to my husband," she said softly, then set the teapot down with a faint clink. She did not say more, but something unspoken filled the space that followed, gentle and full of memory. Caleb wrapped his hands around the warm cup, inhaling the rising steam that soothed the cold lingering in his chest. He glanced at Evelyn, noticing how the lamplight settled into the fine lines of her face, illuminating a life that had held more seasons than he could count. "Thank you for the tea," he said quietly. "You did not have to invite us in." Evelyn's smile widened, thin yet sincere. Sometimes the heart knows when company is needed. Loneliness is a stubborn house guest. It does not leave unless kindness knocks louder. The words settled into him like warm ash. Ranger moved a few steps closer to the closed door, nose lifting as if catching a faint thread of scent weaving under the wood. His tail lowered, not in alarm, but in contemplation. Caleb watched him, sensing a familiar tension, the kind the dog displayed only when the world whispered something subtle. Evelyn's eyes softened. "He is hearing what most people miss," she murmured. "This house keeps certain echoes. It has been waiting a long time to share them." Caleb blinked, uncertain how to respond. Something in her tone felt both simple and extraordinary, as if she were speaking of weather patterns instead of mysteries. The wind outside brushed lightly against the windows, creating a soft tapping that rose and fell like a distant heartbeat. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her fingers resting loosely around her cup. "You remind me of him," she said, nodding toward the door. "Not in looks, but in the way you carry silence." He carried his that way too. Caleb looked down, tracing the rim of his cup. Ranger settled beside him again, though his eyes never fully left the hallway. The house felt warmer now, yet underneath the warmth ran something else, a thread of anticipation winding slowly through the quiet. Evelyn began speaking of small things. Weather, the town, the old bakery that had closed 3 winters ago. Her voice flowed gently, and Caleb found himself listening in a way he had not listened in years. Yet even as they talked, the lamp flickered once, just faintly, and Ranger's ears snapped upward. He released a single low sound, a breath infused with meaning more than worry. Caleb stilled, sensing the subtle shift in the air. Evelyn's gaze drifted to the hallway, her eyes glimmering with a softness that suggested she had been waiting for that very moment. "Some houses," she said quietly, "do not stay silent forever." The words hung suspended between them as we return now to the man seated at the small kitchen table, unaware that something long hidden was preparing to reveal itself. The lamp's glow wavered once more, stretching shadows along the wooden floor as if the house were quietly shifting in its sleep. Caleb felt Ranger lean subtly against his leg, the dog's body steady but alert, his gaze fixed on the closed door at the end of the hallway. Evelyn watched them both with an expression that carried more memory than concern, her fingers slowly tracing the rim of her teacup as though touching something only she could feel. The quiet in the house deepened, not heavy, but purposeful, like the soft pause before a truth begins to rise. Caleb finally set his cup down, the ceramic making a light sound that seemed louder than it should in the gentle hush. "Is there something in that room I should not disturb?" he asked softly. Evelyn shook her head, her white hair catching the lamplight in a faint halo. "No, dear. It is not a matter of disturbance. It is simply that some places hold on to stories until the right years arrive." She stood slowly, steadying herself on the arm of her chair, and Ranger followed her movement with the careful attention he reserved for moments that mattered. She began walking toward the hallway, her steps slow but certain, her presence carrying the gravity of someone approaching a familiar memory she had not touched in a very long time. Caleb hesitated only a moment before rising to follow, Ranger moving ahead of him with deliberate grace. The hallway smelled of cedar and thyme, with framed photographs lining each side. Men in old military uniforms. A younger Evelyn leaning against a porch railing. A middle-aged couple laughing beside a half-painted fence. The images felt warm and lived in, holding echoes of laughter and quiet evenings, and the subtle rhythm of a life built on small, steady joys. Evelyn paused before the closed door, her fingertips resting on the worn brass knob as though greeting an old friend. She looked back at Caleb, her eyes softened by a tenderness that felt both fragile and enduring. "My husband built this room with his own hands," she said. "He believed a house should carry the best pieces of a man's soul." Ranger sat at her feet, ears forward but relaxed, as if acknowledging the weight of the moment. She opened the door. A soft glow greeted them, touched by the afternoon light filtering through lace curtains. The room was small, simple, and meticulously cared for, as though time had stepped around it with respect. A wooden workbench stood against the far wall, scattered with brushes, old radios, and tiny mechanical parts frozen mid-project. A quilt lay folded across a narrow bed, its colors faded but lovingly preserved. Caleb stepped inside with a reverence he had not expected to feel. The air held the faint scent of sawdust and lavender, a mixture that settled into him with a strange familiarity. Evelyn entered behind him, one hand brushing the edge of the workbench. "He used to fix things," she said quietly. "Neighbors would bring anything that had stopped working. He said broken things simply needed patience, not pity." Caleb nodded slowly, feeling the truth of that settle somewhere deep. Ranger moved to a small trunk near the window, sniffing gently before sitting beside it with a sound that was almost a sigh. Evelyn's gaze followed him. "He kept his most important things in there. I have not opened it since he passed." The room fell still. Caleb watched Evelyn as she approached the trunk. Her hands trembled, not with fear, but with the delicate ache of opening a memory untouched for years. She knelt slowly, her fingers finding the latch. It clicked softly, the sound impossibly tender. Ranger shifted closer, his breath steady, his presence grounding the moment. Evelyn lifted the lid. The lamplight seemed to brighten, just slightly, as we return now to the man standing beside her, unaware that what lay inside would begin to change the path he thought he was still wandering. Alone. The lid opened with a soft, time-worn sigh, as though the trunk itself exhaled after years of guarding its quiet burdens. A faint scent of aged paper and cedar drifted upward, carrying with it the warmth of something preserved with love rather than forgotten. Inside, folded neatly as if waiting for gentle hands, lay letters bound with a thin ribbon, yellowed at the edges but carefully kept. Beside them rested a small wooden box, its surface smoothed by countless touches. Evelyn's fingers hovered above the items for a moment, her breath deepening as memories brushed past her like familiar ghosts returning for a visit. Caleb stood close enough to sense the shift in her posture, the way her shoulders softened as though a weight she had carried alone was gently lifting. Ranger sat poised beside them, his amber eyes reflecting the soft light, his calm presence anchoring the room. Evelyn reached first for the ribbon-bound letters, lifting them with a care that suggested they had been written in seasons when hope and heartache lived side by side. She did not open them, only held them to her chest for a quiet beat before placing them gently on the quilted bedspread. "He wrote these to me during the war," she said softly, her voice edged with a tenderness that felt both fragile and vast. "I could never bring myself to read the last one. I felt as if opening it would make the ending too real." Caleb nodded, not out of understanding of the specific loss, but of the ache that comes from holding on to something that once brought both joy and sorrow. His own life had taught him how silence sometimes became the language of survival. Evelyn's hand then moved to the small wooden box. She lifted it carefully, the hinges offering a faint creak as she opened it. Inside lay a silver watch, its face scratched from years of use, its chain tucked neatly beneath it. A tiny inscription gleamed faintly along the inner rim. Evelyn traced the lettering with her thumb. "He wore this every day," she whispered. "Said a man should always know the hour he was living, not the one he wishes he had back." Caleb watched her place the watch beside the letters, the gesture slow and reverent. There was something about the moment that made the room feel fuller, as if the presence of her late husband lingered gently among the warm glow of the lamp. Ranger shifted then, turning his head toward a narrow space at the bottom of the trunk. He lowered his nose, breathing in deeply before touching his paw lightly against a thin wooden compartment built into the trunk's base. Evelyn blinked, surprised. "I did not know there was anything else in there." She leaned closer, her fingers brushing the small panel. It gave slightly under her touch. Caleb knelt beside her and eased the panel upward. It revealed a hidden compartment, lined with cloth that had long since lost its color. Inside rested a single envelope, untouched by time, its seal still unbroken. Evelyn's breath caught, her hand lifting to her mouth. That is his handwriting." The envelope bore her name in firm, steady letters, written with the confidence of a man who believed he would return home to hand it to her himself. Ranger sat perfectly still now, as if sensing that the moment carried a weight beyond simple discovery. Caleb glanced at Evelyn with gentle hesitation. "Do you want to open it?" She held the envelope delicately, her fingers trembling slightly. For a long moment she did not move, her eyes glistening as the lamp cast a soft glow across her weathered features. Then she shook her head. "No, not yet. Some words must be approached slowly." She placed the envelope against her heart, her shoulders lowering as though a circle long left open had finally begun to close. Caleb felt something shift in the room then, an unspoken warmth, a breath of grace settling gently around them. The house itself seemed to fall into a deeper stillness, as we return now to the man kneeling beside the open trunk, unaware that this fragile discovery would soon intertwine his path with hers in ways neither of them could yet see. The late afternoon light settled into the small room with a softened glow, as if the sun itself had paused to honor the tender discovery resting in Evelyn's hands. She held the sealed envelope close, her breathing slow and measured, while Ranger remained positioned at her side, his calm presence carrying the quiet certainty of a sentinel who understood more than words could express. Caleb rose from where he had been kneeling, giving her space without stepping away, sensing that what unfolded next belonged first to her heart, and then to whatever path the moment might open for them both. Evelyn traced the edge of the envelope one more time before placing it gently inside the wooden box, closing the lid with a soft click that echoed like the settling of long-held memories. When she turned back to Caleb, there was a tenderness in her eyes, the kind that grows only from decades of love and loss braided together. "Thank you," she murmured, "for being here. Some things are easier to face when someone else's heart is steady in the room." Caleb nodded, unsure how to respond in words. Instead, he let the quiet stand as his offering. He had lived long enough to know that silence could hold more comfort than speech. Evelyn touched Ranger's head gently. "He felt it," she said. "He knew there was something waiting in that trunk." Animals always seem to sense the turning of a page before people do. Caleb looked down at his companion, noticing the soft way Ranger's ears tilted, the calm weight of his presence grounding the room. The dog exhaled once, almost as if confirming the truth of her words. Evelyn moved toward the window then, pulling back the lace curtain just enough for the fading light to spill across the bed. Outside, the sky had begun to shift into the muted blues of early evening. Snowflakes drifted lazily down from the branches, settling over the yard in a thin white veil that made everything appear gentler than it had the hour before. "The days move faster now," she said softly. "At 96, mornings feel like whispers, and nights feel like deep breaths. But today feels different." Caleb stepped closer, his boots making a quiet rhythm on the worn wooden floor. "Different how?" Evelyn kept her gaze outside, as though the house has been waiting for someone to listen to it again. "It has been very quiet for a long time." The words floated between them, warm and fragile. Ranger lifted his head, ears twitching toward the hallway, as though hearing something subtle. A soft creak sounded, gentle, rhythmic, like the settling of old beams or the brushing of branches against the siding. But the trees were still. Evelyn's eyes softened. "There it is again. My husband used to say the house speaks when the world grows still enough." Caleb listened closely, trying to distinguish the source. He heard nothing unusual, yet the air felt slightly altered, humming with the faint suggestion of a presence that lingered not to frighten, but to witness. Evelyn turned back to him. "This house held our beginning, and then it held our ending. I think it knows when a new chapter is ready to be written." She motioned toward the kitchen. "Come, I want to show you something." Caleb followed her through the hallway, Ranger padding softly at their heels. The kitchen was warm, lit by the amber glow of a small lamp and the faint scent of cinnamon drifting from an old tin near the stove. Evelyn reached for a drawer near the sink, her movements slow but deliberate. Inside lay a ring of keys, some tarnished, others new, each one holding a story of its own. She chose a single brass key and set it gently on the table. "My husband left this for me," she said, "but I never felt it belonged to me alone. The place it opens. I have not had the strength to visit in years." She slid the key toward Caleb. It was cold to the touch, yet something about it thrummed with quiet intention. Ranger leaned closer, sniffing softly before sitting back with an almost expectant stillness. He built more than one room in this house. Evelyn continued. Some spaces are meant to hold grief. Others are meant to hold hope. Her gaze met Caleb's, steady and luminous. Perhaps it is time you saw the place where he kept his hope. The house seemed to hold its breath as we return now to the man standing beside the small kitchen table, unaware that the key resting in his palm was about to unlock far more than a door. The brass key rested in Caleb's palm with a cool weight, as if it carried a quiet intention shaped long before he ever stepped into the house. Evelyn watched him with a softness that held no urgency, only trust, the kind that grows when a moment has been waiting for its rightful witness. The kitchen seemed to settle around them, the warm lamplight gathering along the wooden walls like a hush inviting the next breath. Ranger stood near Caleb's leg, tail still, posture focused, as though he understood that something unspoken had just shifted the course of the evening. Evelyn gestured gently toward the back hallway. He built the room beyond the cellar door because he believed every home should have a place where hope cannot be shaken, she said. I have not walked down there since the winter he passed. Her voice did not break, but it folded inward, carrying the tenderness of memory held carefully for too many years. Caleb closed his fingers around the key, feeling the faint ridges warm beneath his skin. If you would rather I leave it be, I will, he said softly. Evelyn shook her head, the light catching the fine strands of her white hair. No, dear. The house knows your footsteps now, and it seems to think you should see what he left behind. Ranger gave a low breath, not a warning but an affirmation, and Evelyn smiled faintly at him as if he had spoken words. Caleb followed her through the hallway, each step carrying the muted echo of time-worn floorboards. The cellar door was painted a soft blue, faded to the color of a morning sky just before dawn. Evelyn rested her hand on the doorknob with a reverence that made Caleb pause. He always said this door led not to the earth below, but to the light a man must keep even in darkness, she murmured, then stepped aside for Caleb to open it. The doorknob turned easily, and the hinges released a gentle sigh. A narrow staircase descended into soft shadows, illuminated only by a single bulb that glowed like a small captive star. The air felt cool but not cold, carrying a subtle scent of pine and old paper. Ranger moved ahead with slow, deliberate steps, his claws tapping lightly against the wooden stairs. Caleb followed, keeping his hand close to the rail worn smooth by years of use. Each step deepened the quiet, not the silence of emptiness, but the kind that comes when a space has been waiting with patience rather than loneliness. At the bottom of the stairs lay a small room carved from the foundation of the house, shaped not for storage but for sanctuary. Warm lanterns lined the walls, their soft light reflecting off shelves filled with hand-carved wooden figures, birds mid-flight, small cottages, tiny bridges arching over imagined streams. It was a world built from gentle hands and quiet hours, a place where sorrow could not intrude without being softened. On a workbench rested a half-finished carving of a German shepherd, its wooden form captured with such tenderness that Caleb felt a breath catch in his chest. Ranger approached it slowly, touching his nose to the smooth, unfinished muzzle. The moment held a strange familiarity, as if the man who carved it had known a dog much like him or had carved it in faith that one would someday arrive. Evelyn descended the last of the steps, her hand brushing lightly against the wall for balance. When she reached the room, her eyes softened at the sight of the carvings. He made these during the years when his strength began to fade, she said shaping what was like shaping prayer. Each figure was a hope for someone he had not met yet. She moved to the workbench, her fingertips brushing the carved shepherd. This was his final project. He began it the week before he left us. Caleb listened to the gentle tremor in her voice, feeling the weight of the moment settle around them. Ranger sat beside her, head bowed slightly, as though honoring a man he had never known but somehow recognized. Evelyn turned toward Caleb, her eyes shining in the lantern glow. He always believed someone would come who needed this house, someone the Lord would guide to our door. He said the house would know when the right footsteps arrived. The room seemed to breathe then, its walls holding the quiet grace of her words. Caleb felt the truth of it settle deep within him, not as a revelation, but as a gentle clarity. Something in the house had listened to him long before he understood it was listening. And as the lantern light flickered softly across the carved wooden figures, we return now to the man standing in the small sanctuary beneath the earth, unaware that the hope built into the walls around him was beginning to knit itself to his own story. Caleb stood in the quiet sanctuary beneath the house, feeling the gentle hum of the lantern light fold around him like a soft cloak. The carved wooden figures cast long, thoughtful shadows that moved slightly with each flicker, as if the hopes etched into them were shifting to make room for new ones. Ranger remained still beside the unfinished carving of the German shepherd, his posture calm yet attentive, as though he recognized some invisible thread connecting him to the man who had shaped it years before. Evelyn rested one hand on the workbench, steadying herself as she looked around the room her husband had crafted with hands that believed in patience over perfection. Her gaze softened when it landed on the tiny carvings of cottages and bridges, each one a quiet testament to the life she had shared with him. "He always said hope does not disappear," she murmured, her voice warm despite the thinness of age. "It simply waits for new hands to carry it forward." Caleb listened, absorbing the weight of her words in a way that felt both grounding and strangely uplifting. He had spent so long drifting from place to place, rarely stopping long enough to let anything take root. Yet here, in a room filled with the careful work of a man he had never met, he felt something settle inside him like a gentle anchor. Evelyn stepped closer to him, her steps small but certain. "You remind me of how he looked when he first came home," she said quietly, worn down from the world, but still carrying more kindness than he ever admitted. Caleb lowered his gaze, unsure whether he deserved such a comparison. Ranger nudged his hand, offering silent reassurance. The moment stretched into a soft stillness, one that felt neither heavy nor empty, but full in a way Caleb had not felt in years. The sound of the wind whispered faintly through the cracks of the cellar door above, carrying the distant rustle of snow shifting across the yard. Evelyn reached out and touched the brass key still held in Caleb's hand. "There is one more place he built," she said. "Not many knew about it. He called it his chapel of small mercies. It is behind the greenhouse, beneath the lilac tree." Caleb looked at her, surprised. "A chapel? Not in the church sense," she said with a soft smile. "Just a place where he went to talk to God when words were hard to find. It is simple, quiet. He kept it unlocked because he believed a locked door might discourage someone who needed a moment of grace." Ranger's ears lifted slightly, sensing the shift in purpose. Caleb nodded slowly, feeling the quiet invitation settle into him. "I can look at it, if you want me to." Evelyn shook her head gently. "Not for me, dear. For you, and perhaps for him." Her smile warmed, though a faint tremble crossed the edges of her expression. "And for whatever future this house seems to believe you are meant to have." She turned then, moving toward the stairs with careful steps. Caleb followed, Ranger close at his side, the lantern light dimming behind them as they ascended. When they reached the kitchen again, the early evening sky outside had deepened into a soft indigo, the first stars peeking through the thin veil of clouds. The house felt warmer now, as if the unveiling of its hidden room had lifted a quiet sigh from its walls. Evelyn moved toward the worn armchair by the small living room window. She lowered herself into it with the ease of someone returning to a familiar resting place. Caleb stood beside her, unsure whether to speak or let the moment settle. Before he could choose, Evelyn spoke first. "Caleb," she murmured, her gaze drifting toward the snowy yard beyond the fogged glass. "Whatever brought you here, it was not an accident." Her hand rested lightly over her heart, where the sealed envelope had been only hours earlier. Sometimes God arranges the smallest steps without telling us the journey we are beginning. Ranger lay at her feet, head on his paws, eyes half closed yet watchful. Caleb felt the quiet truth of her words sink deeper than he expected, weaving itself into the stillness around them. And as the night slowly gathered outside, we return now to the man standing in the warm glow of a house that had begun to open its secrets to him, unaware that the greatest revelation had yet to unfold. The night deepened around the house with a softness that felt almost protective, as though the winter sky itself wished to cradle the quiet unfolding within its walls. A thin scatter of stars shimmered through the drifting clouds, casting faint reflections onto the snow-covered yard. Inside, the lamp near Evelyn's chair glowed like a small hearth, warming the corners of the room with its gentle amber light. Caleb remained standing for a moment, unsure whether the calm settling over the house was asking him to sit or simply to listen. Ranger had already stretched out beside Evelyn's chair, his breathing steady, his eyes half open as if keeping quiet watch between the worlds of rest and awareness. Evelyn rested her hands on her lap, her fingers laced loosely together. There was a peacefulness in her posture, the kind that comes only when a long-held burden begins to ease. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, yet it carried the clarity of someone who had lived long enough to understand the shape of her own ending. "Caleb," she murmured, "I have had many days in this house. Winter mornings, spring storms, long summers where the cicadas sang louder than my own thoughts." She paused, breathing in slowly. "But tonight feels like the last page of a chapter one had been reading for a very long time." Caleb knelt beside her chair, not from obligation, but from a quiet instinct to be near. "If you need anything," he said gently, "I am here." Evelyn smiled at him, a small, grateful expression that made the lines around her eyes soften. "You have already given me exactly what I need. Company for the closing, and a reminder that kindness still finds its way to the doorstep." Ranger lifted his head and rested it against her slipper, offering the silent comfort only a loyal dog could give. She reached down and brushed her fingers across his fur, her touch light but sure. The room grew still again, the only sound the faint whisper of wind brushing gently against the frosted window pane. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, letting her eyes drift toward the snowy yard outside. "When my husband passed," she said, her voice barely above a breath, "I prayed that the house would not be left to loneliness. He built it with so much hope. I could not bear the thought of it fading without someone to carry that hope forward." She turned her gaze back to Caleb, her expression luminous with something deeper than mere gratitude. "And then you arrived. You and this noble creature beside you. Not because you were searching, but because you were guided." Caleb felt a warmth gather in his chest, not sharp or overwhelming, but slow and steady, like embers beginning to glow. Evelyn continued, her words weaving themselves into the quiet air with gentle certainty. "This home, it is meant to be lived in by someone whose heart knows how to rebuild. Someone who understands the language of silence. Someone who carries compassion even when life has taken much from him." She lifted a hand with some effort and placed it briefly over Caleb's. Her touch was cool but filled with a peace that seemed to pass from her into the room itself. "It is yours," she whispered. "The house, his workshop, the sanctuary, all of it. It belongs to you now." Caleb froze, breath stilled, as if the world itself paused to absorb her words. Ranger shifted, pressing closer to his side. Evelyn leaned back once more, closing her eyes with a serenity that felt almost otherworldly. "God had bigger plans," she murmured. "I see that now." Her breathing grew slower, each inhale softer, each exhale fading into the hush of the room. The lamp continued its warm glow, painting her features with the tenderness of a life lived fully and a departure embraced with grace. Caleb remained beside her, his hand resting lightly over hers. Ranger curled protectively at her feet. And in that sacred stillness, before the first snowflake of the late evening drifted past the window, we return now to the man and his faithful companion, seated in the quiet presence of a passing that felt less like an ending and more like a blessing placed gently into their keeping.